He had lived alone for nearly a decade, ever since his beloved wife passed away. The days dragged on in silence, the nights even heavier, filled only with the ticking of a clock and the echo of memories. Neighbors pitied him, family visited less and less. In his 70s, he believed his life would end in solitude until one Sunday, at a small church gathering, everything changed. She appeared almost suddenly, like a figure stepping out of the sunlight into his shadowed world. She was decades younger, graceful yet modest, with a warm smile that seemed to reach straight into the emptiness of his heart. The congregation introduced her as a volunteer devoted to service, always helping the elderly. She listened attentively to his stories, laughed at his faded jokes, and for the first time in years, the old man felt seen. Though his children frowned at the thought, he could not deny the comfort she brought. What harm could there be, he told himself, in letting someone ease his loneliness? The weeks turned into months, and their bond deepened with surprising speed. She cooked his meals, organized his medicines, and walked with him through the park as if she had always been part of his life. To outsiders, it seemed unthinkable, an elderly man finding companionship in a woman young enough to be his daughter. To him, it was salvation. The whispers of neighbors and protests of family were drowned out by the simple joy of not being alone. When he proposed marriage, her acceptance was gentle, almost inevitable, as though she had been waiting for the question all along. Against his children's warnings, he stood tall and declared, "This is my new beginning." And so, with quiet vows exchanged beneath the church's wooden beams, the lonely widower believed he had found love again. His children gathered one evening, voices sharp with worry. "She's too young," his eldest son said. "She's after your money, can't you see?" But the old man shook his head, frustration etched on his face. "She has been more present in my life than any of you," he replied, his tone cutting. Silence followed, heavy and awkward. The young wife-to-be simply sat beside him, her hands folded neatly, her eyes lowered with humility. When she finally spoke, her words were calm, soft, and disarming. "I only wish to care for him, nothing more." Her sincerity seemed unquestionable, her voice carrying a warmth that even his suspicious children found difficult to challenge. Though they left unconvinced, they could not deny the strange aura she held, the way she seemed to dissolve every argument with quiet composure. Once married, she slipped seamlessly into the role of a devoted wife. She prepared his meals with careful attention, remembered the smallest details of his routine, and accompanied him to every doctor's appointment. At church, she was praised as a blessing, the congregation admiring her kindness and dedication. To the old man, it was as though life had been rewound, granting him one final chapter filled with care and companionship. His children, though still uneasy, were forced to admit that their father seemed healthier, happier, almost rejuvenated. They could find no cracks in her devotion. When neighbors asked about the marriage, he would smile with pride. "She saved me," he would say. In her presence, the weight of loneliness seemed to lift, replaced by a steady comfort that he clung to desperately. The whispers of doubt faded, at least for a while. The change in him was undeniable. Where once he shuffled slowly through the house, he now moved with a renewed spark. He laughed more, shared stories again, and even took up tending the garden he had long neglected. The neighbors marveled, calling it a miracle of love. To his children, it was unsettling to watch their father transform under the influence of a woman they barely knew. But the old man himself was blind to any shadow. He clung to her presence, convinced that fate had finally rewarded him for years of loneliness. Every glance at her smile reassured him. Every touch of her hand silenced the doubts gnawing at the edges of his mind. He believed wholeheartedly that he had been granted a second chance at happiness, and he would not let anyone take it from him. It happened without warning. One morning, the old man failed to rise from his bed. The young wife called for help, her voice sharp with panic. But by the time the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. Whispers spread quickly, a stroke, sudden and merciless. His children, grief-stricken, gathered once more, yet their sorrow was shadowed by suspicion. The young wife moved swiftly, arranging the funeral with a precision that unsettled even the pastor. She wept openly, her cries echoing in the quiet halls of the funeral home. Yet her efficiency in handling every detail left others uneasy. Still, no one dared to speak against her. She was, after all, the grieving widow. On the day of the funeral, mourners filled the chapel, the air heavy with incense and sorrow. The young wife sat at the front, her face pale, her tears falling steadily as though scripted from tragedy itself. Some whispered that her grief was genuine, others that it seemed too perfect. Yet as she knelt by the casket, clutching the old man's hand one last time, even the most skeptical felt a pang of pity. Neighbors muttered, "Perhaps we judged her too harshly." His children, though bitter, could not ignore the image she projected: devotion, sorrow, and love. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though she might truly have been the blessing their father had claimed. Sympathy outweighed suspicion, and the widow stood bathed in an aura of tragic purity. But then the doors opened, and the air shifted. A man stepped into the chapel, his face stern, his steps heavy with anger. Behind him, two young children clung to his coat, their wide eyes darting nervously. Gasps rippled through the mourners as they turned to stare. The man pointed a trembling hand toward the grieving widow. "That woman," he declared, his voice breaking, "is my wife. And these are our children." The room erupted in whispers, disbelief surging like a wave. The widow froze, her tears halting, her face caught between shock and calculation. The children stared at her as though waiting for her to explain. The old man's family stood stunned into silence, their grief instantly eclipsed by confusion and betrayal. In that single moment, the portrait of the perfect wife cracked, and something far darker began to show through. The chapel fell into chaos, voices overlapping in disbelief. The widow rose to her feet, trembling, her eyes locked on the man and the children. Yet before she could speak, another figure entered, a woman who looked almost identical to her. Gasps echoed as mourners rubbed their eyes, unsure if grief had conjured a ghost. Two women, the same face, the same features, stood across the room, separated only by their expressions. One wide-eyed with fear, the other calm, almost defiant. The resemblance was uncanny, impossible to explain away. Whispers swept through the crowd. How can there be two of her? The stranger's voice cut through the confusion. They're twin sisters, he said bitterly. One married me, the other married him. A stunned silence followed. The widow's face hardened, no longer soft with sorrow, but cold with resolve. You don't understand, she hissed. We did what we had to do. The family recoiled as realization settled in. Every odd moment, every unexplained absence, every too perfect excuse suddenly made sense. The old man had never questioned why his wife seemed to be in two places at once, at church, at the market, at his side, because he hadn't realized he was living with not one woman, but two. It was a deception carried out with seamless precision, a performance that spanned years. His children remembered the countless moments that had unsettled them. The time their father swore she had been at his doctor's appointment, even as they themselves saw her volunteering across town. The strange lapses in memory, as though she didn't recall stories she had once laughed at before. The faint perfume that shifted from day to day. Every detail they had dismissed as forgetfulness or quirks of personality now fell neatly into place. The truth was horrifyingly simple. They had never truly known who their father had married. Was it the sister he loved, or the one who merely played the role? The boundary between devotion and betrayal had been blurred from the very beginning. The family's minds raced back through the past 2 years, piecing together fragments that no longer seemed harmless. The son recalled arriving one afternoon to find her cooking in the kitchen, yet his neighbor swore she had seen her at the market at that exact hour. A daughter remembered how the woman once stared blankly at her, unable to recall a private story she had shared only weeks before. There had been 2 sets of habits, one sister sweet and attentive, the other curt and businesslike. The old man, blinded by love and relief from loneliness, had mistaken the inconsistencies for quirks of aging. But now the duplicity was undeniable. What they once dismissed as chance or memory lapses revealed itself as a chillingly organized deception. The man they buried had lived with a stranger and, perhaps, never truly known who stood at his side in his final days. Driven by suspicion, the eldest son demanded to see the marriage certificate. The widow hesitated, her eyes narrowing, before producing the papers from her bag. The family huddled together, scanning the lines with trembling fingers. At first glance, everything appeared normal: his name, her name, the official seal. But then came the revelation. The name on the document did not match the widow they knew. It was the sister's. A chilling silence fell over the room. The legal wife of their father was not the woman who had sat at his bedside, not the one who wept so perfectly over his coffin, but her twin. The reality sank in. One sister had secured the marriage. The other had played the role of wife when convenient. Every prayer, every meal, every gesture of love had been a masquerade, carefully staged to protect the fraud. The old man had not only been deceived, he had been legally bound into their scheme. The papers shook in the son's hands as anger rose in his chest. "So who are you?" he demanded, pointing at the woman still dressed in black. Her lips curled into a faint, almost mocking smile. "Does it matter?" she asked softly. "We are one and the same." Her words struck like venom, erasing the boundary between truth and illusion. The children shouted, the mourners gasped, but the woman remained calm, her composure terrifying in its serenity. "Your father was happy," she continued. "That was all he wanted. Isn't that enough?" The family recoiled, torn between fury and the haunting possibility that she was right. Had their father truly cared who she was, or had he clung only to the comfort she provided? The question twisted like a blade. Was this betrayal, or merely the cruelest form of love? The line between devotion and deceit blurred beyond recognition, leaving only a hollow certainty. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was that the sisters had won. The room erupted in chaos. His children shouted over one another, their grief transforming into unrestrained rage. "You deceived him," cried the daughter, tears streaking her face. "You robbed him of his final years." The son bellowed, fists clenched at his sides. The mourners shifted uncomfortably, caught between sympathy for the family and morbid fascination with the widow who stood so still. The pastor tried to calm the storm, but his words fell into the rising tide of fury. The family demanded answers, demanded justice, but the law was not on their side. Legally, one of the sisters was the wife. And with that single fact, the foundation of their outrage began to crumble into despair. The old man's final chapter had been written in deceit, and yet bound by ink and paper. The deception carried the weight of truth. It was a revelation too bitter to swallow. The widow no longer wept. Her tears had dried, her hands folded calmly before her, as though the funeral were merely a formality. Gone was the trembling widow draped in sorrow. In her place stood a woman unshaken, her eyes sharp, her mouth curved with the faintest trace of amusement. She no longer offered words of comfort or explanations. When accused, she responded with silence, letting her stillness become an answer in itself. It was as if the mask had finally slipped, revealing not a grieving spouse, but an architect of something far colder. The family stared in disbelief, realizing too late that the devotion they had doubted was not false, it was borrowed, impersonated, and now discarded. The woman in black no longer played the role of loving wife. She stood only as a victor, indifferent to the pain around her. In the days that followed, the family sought every legal path they could. Lawyers examined the documents, investigators traced the sisters' history, but the truth was inescapable. The marriage certificate bore the sisters' name, signed and sealed by law. The deception was immoral, yes, but it was not illegal. The court cannot dissolve what has already been recognized, one lawyer explained grimly. The children protested, furious that the system would reward such treachery, but the law was deaf to morality. The young widow appeared at every proceeding with the same calm detachment, her hands folded, her eyes never betraying fear. Each ruling cut the family deeper, confirming that their father's estate would pass, at least in part, to her. They were forced to watch, helpless, as the very institution meant to protect them instead became the shield of their deceiver. Soon the inevitable came. The court finalized its decision, granting the legal wife, the sister who had signed the papers, control over a significant share of the inheritance. The children sat in silence, rage burning beneath their grief. The house their father built, the savings he had preserved, the treasures of a lifetime, all now claimed by a woman who had never truly been his. The widow left the courtroom without a word, her footsteps echoing with quiet triumph. For the family, the battle was lost before it had begun. They realized too late that their father's devotion had blinded him, and that blindness had cost them everything. It was not just money that slipped away, but dignity, legacy, and truth. In the end, the story was not of love, but of illusion. The old man had believed in a companion who was never fully real, a bond crafted from shadows and lies. The children, left behind, carried the bitter lesson that not every smile hides sincerity, and not every vow is made in truth. As they stood before their father's grave, one thought echoed like a curse. If even a face so familiar could mask betrayal, what certainty remained in this world? Sometimes, the greatest deception is not what strangers bring into our lives, but what we welcome into our homes.